Alright, so I'm going to continue here on the role of microorganisms in wastewater treatment. This is prep for day 7 of water filtration, not for day 6 as the previous notes were. And in retrospect, there may be yet another video because I'm not sure I'm going to get through everything that I want to get to. But again, I'm going to keep my eye on the time to keep things reasonable for you. So what I want to do is just review a different format of this classification of the bacteria that would be part of the microorganisms. It actually makes up about 95% of the microorganisms, or the activated sludge. And it does all the reactions to pull out the energy and the carbon sources out of the food or the waste, their food, our waste, out of the water. So what I'm going to do is just orient you to what the terms are here. You may need to pause it. I'm going to move kind of quick. For the interest of time, but you can pause. You should pause it and jot these down. So we've got classification, energy source, and carbon source here as headings. And underneath, what I've done is actually made two categories, color-coded them. So I've got autotrophic and heterotrophic organisms, but we've got several types of autotrophic categories or classifications. We've got photoautotrophic and chemoautotrophic. If you don't remember what those mean, review back to the previous notes. We've got chemoheterotrophic and photoheterotrophic, which might seem kind of, the photoheterotrophic might seem kind of counterintuitive. What we're going to do is list the energy sources here and the carbon sources here. And so this is what I have. Light is the energy source for the autotrophic organisms, the photoautotrophic, photo meaning light, and their carbon source is carbon dioxide. So if you think about photosynthesis, what they're getting out of the environment as reactants for photosynthesis is carbon dioxide out of the air, light, and water out of the ground. But water is neither an energy source nor a carbon source. Interestingly, the electrons that are within the water molecule, remember the covalent bonds between each of the two hydrogens and the single oxygen in water, represents electrons. The light energy actually breaks the water molecule up and takes some of the electrons away from the water. We didn't talk about that in 9th grade, but we can talk more about that if you'd like. You need to ask me about it, though. We've got chemoautotrophs that use inorganic, non-carbon containing molecules on a surface level, but really organic requires having carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. Therefore, CO2 is inorganic, but it doesn't what we call oxidation and reduction reactions, or sometimes they're called redox reactions, reduction, oxidation, redox. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that at the end of this video. Redox reactions, but the carbon source is carbon dioxide. For the heterotrophic organisms, we've got organic oxidation reduction reactions and some kind of organic carbon as the carbon source. And what we mean by that are carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, nucleic acids. And I would jot that down. I'm not going to take the time to do that, but I need you to do that. Organic carbon is found in the carbs, lipids, proteins, and nucleic acids. Photoheterotrophs use light, and they use organic carbon as opposed to the inorganic carbon of carbon dioxide. They use some organic carbon source. And so you're going to jot that down to make sure you understand that and you understand this terminology. And you're going to need to commit this oxidation reduction stuff to memory. But we're going to spend a little bit more time building up to that. So let's review metabolism. And two major reactions that sum up all of metabolism. So the metabolism is more or less the processing of nutrients. You've heard people say I've got good metabolism or a fast metabolism versus a slow metabolism. It's about how well they process their nutrients. So what I have here is the metabolism is the sum of all of the chemical processes that occur within a cell. Every single reaction is one of these two types. It's either anabolism or catabolism. And what I'm going to do is add a couple of notes here so that you can remember what terms we use for these for anabolism and catabolism. So for anabolism, This is the synthesis of more complex compounds and the use of energy. So we're using energy to make larger molecules. Making larger molecules. So we call these dehydration reactions. Last year, I'm going to write it as RXN reaction. We also call this polymerization reactions. Remember polymers? We call these synthesis reactions. Or we call these condensation reactions. Alright, so these are all the different terms that you need to know, commit to memory if you have not, or remind yourself of those. In catabolism, which is the breakdown of a substance or substrate and capturing the energy that is released when it's broken, we refer to as hydrolysis. And we really focus on the role of water in that process. That's critical, but everything that happens in your body is either anabolism or catabolism. And of course we would have more specific names for them, but they fall into one of those two major categories. So, apologies for that. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the overview of how anabolism and catabolism work. So what I've drawn here in this lighter blue color is a bacterial cell. Here's an organelle that you should know the name of. Oh, sorry about that. I'm on the wrong layer. Alright, so I want you to be able to identify what that is, as well as this double, these double lines, what they might mean. What I have in yellow, it's color-coded to the terms that I had on here. So yellow is anabolism. So maybe I'll write that here for you guys. Anabolism. So we're taking nutrients for biosynthesis, or for the making of biological tissue or cells. That anabolism is taking those nutrients and combining them to make larger macromolecules and other cell components. That's critical, right? So when a cell is growing, it needs to be able to do that. But we've also got this catabolic process. So label here catabolism. This catabolic process that takes chemicals and light, and it's going to break them apart, right? So some of that energy that's in those chemicals, maybe the carbs, lipids, proteins, is going to move in to this anabolic process. But it could also be used directly for motility by converting into ATP, transporting of those nutrients, and so on, moving things around the cell. And sometimes it's considered waste products with acids, alcohols, carbon dioxide, or reduced electron acceptors. And here again is this term of reduction, right? Reduced, reduction. So oxidation and reduction are going to be critical terms for you to understand in this biological pathway of what the microorganisms are able to do and how they're able to process things. And in fact, that's true in your body as well. So let's talk about each of these two processes. Let's talk about catabolism first. And so what I have here is that catabolism, which is also known as destructive metabolism. Destructive metabolism. It's kind of a strange analogy, like in engineering, in technology class. Maybe Coach C has used the term additive and subtractive construction. So like a CNC machine will be carving out wood to make the shape, or whatever material, but to make a shape that you have pre-programmed to do. It carves away at it. That's destructive, or sorry, subtractive construction. Another way to think of that is someone sculpting a statue, or sculpting, like Michelangelo carving something out of stone. That would be subtractive construction. This is destructive metabolism. You take something large and you break it down. But in a biological sense, what is really happening is that we're converting fuels into cellular energy. So here's a reaction that hopefully should look familiar to you. So if you take some kind of fuel, whether it be carbohydrates or fats, you can turn it into carbon dioxide, water, and energy. And in the case of what we've been talking about, we want that to be ATP, or adenosine triphosphate. Write that all out. Now, the way this is actually written anaerobically, without oxygen. If you added oxygen into this equation, you added oxygen gas, then it would increase the rate at which the fuel can be turned into an energy source. So aerobic respiration is far more efficient at energy production than anaerobic respiration. But it can happen without oxygen, right? So it can happen without oxygen, and you can still make that energy. What that energy is used for, that's why there's a little star here. What that energy is used for is for the synthesis of new cells. So when an organism is growing, whether it's unicellular or multicellular, it's going to make new cells. If it's a unicellular organism, those new cells happen to be new individuals. If it's a multicellular organism, for the most part, that's more cells for the organism. But that organism also has a reproductive component that will be making new cells for the next generation. But it's not just new cells, it's also for the maintenance of certain cell functions. So there's certain things that the cells have to be able to do to survive, and those require energy. But what happens again in catabolism, if we take these fuels, we're breaking them down into these smaller components. This is basically taking these large molecules and breaking them down into smaller pieces. That's what hydrolysis is. When an external food source, though, is interrupted, which means like that food is maybe like no longer available, right? Or there's less of it available. Individual organisms will use the stored food for maintenance energy. So if you consume lots and lots of energy and you store it, let's say you store lots and lots of fat in your body, or even carbohydrates, right? If you remember back to last year, we talked about a polysaccharide called glycogen. Glycogen is a large molecule, large carbohydrate that can be stored in your muscles and in your liver. And when you no longer have a steady food source, your body is going to pull from that and use that to make this ATP. That term is endogenous catabolism. All right? I think you know endo meaning inside, right? So endogenous catabolism. We're not taking some external fuel, we're taking something that's already part of our body and breaking it down. So let's talk about anabolism. Anabolism is when is constructive metabolism. So this is like additive construction. Going back to my analogy with technology and construction, this is what a 3D printer does, right? It does one layer at a time. It adds to the structure. What you did with building your prototypes of your greenhouses was constructive. It's additive construction. So this is constructive metabolism, where you're building something, and it provides the material necessary for cell growth, whether that is it provides the material necessary for it. So it's going to make these large molecules that are absolutely required. So these small precursor molecules or early molecules are assembled into larger organic molecules. And it absolutely requires energy, usually in the form of ATP, again, adenosine triphosphate. But alternatives to that could be GTP, guanine triphosphate, cytosine triphosphate, right? Or thymine triphosphate. And we can talk more about those and their role in some processes of like DNA replication. We didn't talk about this. We didn't go into the detail of it, but they're involved in DNA replication in making these large molecules of DNA. But again, the energy plus small molecules lead to these complex molecules. Absolutely required to use energy. Okay? And then the last thing here is this large overview, and I know I'm looking at 15 minutes right now. I'm going to go over just a little bit. I apologize about that. this is about energy relationships between catabolism and anabolism. So I've created this diagram to kind of maybe show you a little bit about how these things fit together. And this is what I'm going to explain redox reactions, or give you a little teaser into redox reactions. So if we start in the upper left here, we've got energy yielding nutrients, or nutrients that will give off lots and lots of energy. And what you should see here are some familiar terms: carbohydrates, lipids, and proteins. We spent a lot of time talking about those last year. These carbs, lipids, and proteins are going to go through some catabolism, right? So they're going to get broken down. They're going to be hydrolyzed. They're going to get broken down into smaller components. And they end up with these small things like water, carbon dioxide, maybe even ammonia, depending on which cycle and what reactions we're talking about. In the nitrogen cycle, we'd end up with some ammonia. These things don't carry a lot of energy. Most of the energy at the end of, again, cellular respiration with carbohydrates like glucose that we learned about last year, this glucose gets broken down into H2O and CO2 and ATP. But here's that ATP, right? That's the chemical energy that's going to be used in a later process by the organism. That's catabolism, but it's oxidative, okay? So this is oxidation. And oxidation is when a molecule loses its electrons. All right, electrons are pulled away from it. So C6H12O6 has a lot of electrons. Every covalent bond in that molecule is representing two electrons. And those are just valence electrons. There are a lot more within each of those atoms. So those electrons get pulled off of these large molecules. And when that gets pulled off of the molecule, we say that that molecule that is now missing the electron is oxidated or oxidized. Okay? And then the thing that receives the electrons, we say, is reduced. So glucose would be oxidized, ATP would be reduced because ATP is gaining the electrons. Those electrons find their way over into this anabolic process where we take these precursor molecules. Again, we're talking about energy here, not talking about these molecules. But the energy in those electrons get added into these smaller pieces. So amino acids, sugars like monosaccharides and disaccharides, fatty acid, nitrogenous bases like adenine, thymine, guanine, cytosine get recombined through anabolic reactions or condensation reactions to these larger molecules, and they're reduced, right? They're reduced because they accept those extra electrons. So they take those electrons and they end up in these macromolecules of proteins, polysaccharides, lipids, nucleic acids, which allow for cells to grow, which is what those microorganisms are trying to do in your wastewater. We're trying to grow those microorganisms because what they're going to do is pull out those carbs, lipids, and proteins that were in the water, They get broken down, pulled in, remade into those macromolecules within the cells of those microorganisms. And then we can get rid of those microorganisms. Okay? I'm going to stop there because I'm already at 18 and a half minutes.